God says walk. Walk up. Walk out. Walk into the wilderness. If your legs shake, go slow. If you wonder how you will get there, just look for a next step. If you don't even know where there is that you're getting to, take one rock and place it on another. And remember,
Kent Cove, good morning. Wow, the lights seem extra bright this morning. It's the sun. The sun! How about that? Okay, well, I can't see you, but good morning. This morning we continue our series in Exodus, and I'm going to be reading from Exodus 16, beginning in verse 13 in just a moment. A little context before we start reading. So we're picking up here in the middle of the story of God's provision for the people in the wilderness. Now, one of the things that's important to recognize as we go through this series, as I said at the beginning, we're not going through chronologically necessarily and following the story very closely. We're looking at certain themes that emerge in the story throughout time. Now, one thing to recognize as we talk this morning about the wilderness is that at this point in the story, the people of Israel have been in the wilderness for about a month. Okay? So not very long. They have a long way to go before they enter the promised land. So just a little context for you there. So beginning in verse 13 of Exodus 16. In the evening, quails came up and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a fine flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather as much of it as each of you needs, an omer to a person according to the number of persons, all providing for those in their own tents." The Israelites did so, some gathering more, some less. But when they measured it with an omer, those who gathered much had nothing over, and those who gathered little had no shortage. They gathered as much as each of them needed. And Moses said to them, "Let no one leave any of it over until morning." But they did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and became foul. And Moses was angry with them. Morning by morning they gathered it, as much as each needed, but when the sun grew hot, it melted. On the sixth day they gathered twice as much food, 2 omers apiece. When all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil, and all that is left over put aside to be kept until morning." So they put it aside until morning, as Moses commanded them, and it did not become foul, and there were no worms in it. Moses said, "Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day, which is a Sabbath, there will be none." On the 7th day, some of the people went out to gather, and they found none. The Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and instructions? See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the 6th day, he gives you food for 2 days. Each of you stay where you are. Do not leave your place on the 7th day." So the people rested on the 7th day. The house of Israel called it manna. It was like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. Moses said, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Let an omer of it be kept throughout your generations, in order that they may see the food with which I fed you in the wilderness, when I brought you out of the land of Egypt." And Moses said to Aaron, "Take a jar, put an omer of manna in it, and place it before the Lord to be kept throughout your generations. As the Lord commanded Moses, so Aaron placed it before the covenant for safekeeping. The Israelites ate manna 40 years until they came to a habitable land. They ate manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. Please join me in prayer. Bless us this day, O Lord, with vision. May this place be a sacred place, a telling space, where heaven and earth meet. Amen. So this morning, we are looking at this idea of the wilderness and the way that God provides for his people there. Now, I don't know about all of you, but one of the things that Gretchen and I have found helpful in our relationship and in our family is a tool called the Enneagram. Now, I'm not going to go into all the different things about the Enneagram, but my number on the Enneagram is a 5. And one of the things that is true of 5s is that, and I'll be honest, this is one of the things that drives me crazy. This is the thing about this number that if I don't want it, I want it to go away. Gretchen brings it up and it makes it's a button, right? And that's that 5s have this thing with scarcity. We are very concerned that we have enough. And specifically, it's about energy. It's about the energy to be in the world with people and how we interact and all of that there isn't enough to go around. So it's called a scarcity mindset. And part of the reason it drives me so insane is because it's so true. Right? And it extends not just to those things, but also to other things. We can have this tendency to look at the world as if there isn't going to be enough. Enough energy, enough money, enough fill in the blank, right? Enough time, all of those things. Now, this is not necessarily just something that people who are 5s on the Enneagram experience. In fact, as we'll get into, I would suggest that in some ways our whole economy is built on a scarcity mindset. It's built on the idea that there is only so much pie and we better get ours, right? So this is important as we enter the wilderness with the people of Israel. Now think about wilderness for a few minutes. The wilderness is a place of barrenness to be avoided or to be prepared for so that we can survive it, right? I mean, if you go on Google and type in wilderness stories, what you will find primarily are not necessarily wilderness stories. You will find survival stories. Stories of amazing feats of how people survived a wilderness, whether that wilderness be the mountains or forest or desert or whatever it is. How did they make it through, right? The wilderness is a place of barrenness to be avoided. But what if we were to view the wilderness not as a place of barrenness, but as the birthplace of abundance? One of my favorite theologians is a guy named Walter Brueggemann, and he said this about the wilderness. Even the wilderness, or especially the wilderness that appears to fall outside the fruitfulness of creation, turns out to be a venue presided over by the God of abundance. Right? So the people of Israel have been driven into the wilderness, and they're about to spend a lot of time there. But in the midst of that wilderness, that appears, by all appearance, when we find ourselves or we look at the wilderness, we see barrenness, we see scarcity, we see something to be afraid of. But Brueggemann argues that this is a venue that is actually also provided over by the God of abundance. That is an interesting turn. And so we have in this story this idea that the people of Israel have now been in the wilderness for all of about a month. And they are already, if you read the verses right before this, as they have been from almost the very beginning, they are already doing what? Grumbling, complaining, whining, talking about how it would be better if they had stayed in Egypt. And it's easy for us, as we talked about last week, to look at them and think, well, how could they be so stupid? But to do so, we miss something that the Bible does over and over and over again. And that is to draw us into the story, to make us feel that way, and then to draw us in even deeper until we realize that they are us. Because when we find ourselves in those places, maybe it's just me, but I find myself complaining. I find myself saying, God, where are you? Why are you not doing this? This is not according to plan. My plan, right? So what does God do? Well, God provides for the people. He gives them provision. And where we picked up in the text, the first it's the quail in the evening, but then it's also the manna. Now, the thing about manna is, I find this fascinating. We don't know exactly what it was, and in fact, if you look in the Hebrew, the Israelites didn't know what to make of it either. And in fact, the very name manna comes from the Hebrew words that mean "what is it?" And so, quite literally, manna is "what is it bread?" What is it bread? So the Israelites are provided for, but they don't know what it is. And so they have to ask Moses, well, what is it? And Moses' response is either very patient or, I suspect, having some experience in leadership, that it was a little bit with some attitude, and his response is, it is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. Suck it up, boil it, bake it, make it, eat it. Which is the other thing that's amazing about this stuff, is you can do all the text tells us directly there that you can do all those things with it. So it's an amazing little flake that you can do all these different things and prepare in all these different ways. And the way it's described doesn't sound bad to me. Numbers describes it as like wafers made of honey or something with olive oil. And in Numbers 11, it says that it can be ground in a mill, crushed in a mortar, cooked in a pot, or made into cakes. So the Lord provides this manna. And that's a miracle. It's a miraculous provision. And I think I've always looked at it that way, that that's the miracle. But perhaps the bigger miracle is not in the provision itself, but what that provision teaches us about receiving God's abundance and provision. Perhaps the lesson in the manna is not so much that God miraculously provides as it is about teaching us how it is that we receive God's provision for us. A couple of things we notice in this story. The first is this, and this is important for those of us who experience life from or have been trained to experience life from that scarcity mindset, that there isn't enough, that there's only so much pie and we got to fight for ours, right? You'll notice that in this story, the provision, the manna, the quail, both of which, there is enough, it is for everyone, and there is enough for everyone. It is for everyone. No one is excluded. There's no hierarchy in the camp of Israel in the wilderness. God has provided for them manna and quail to eat, and it is for everyone, and there is enough for everyone. Now, what's fascinating about this is you will see this theme echoed now throughout the rest of this great story of God's pursuit of his people that we call the Scriptures. God's provision is enough, and it is for everyone. Jesus, in the prayer that he taught us when the disciples asked him to teach us to pray, it should not be lost on us that Jesus teaches us to pray, "Give us this day our daily bread." If you don't think that the phrase daily bread didn't automatically transport the people to whom Jesus was speaking, these Jewish fishermen, right back to this Exodus story, then you're not paying attention. Give us this day our daily bread, Jesus says. And if that weren't enough, he does two miracles, two feeding miracles in the Gospel of Mark that call to mind this very thing. Chapter 6 and 8 in Mark, if you want to read it. And essentially, to paraphrase what happens in these stories, is Jesus takes what little food there is that is present in these great crowds of people, and he provides more than enough for everyone there. Does that sound familiar? Right? Jesus is faced by these big crowds who are hungry, and there isn't enough food, and so he provides enough for everyone who is there. Now, one of the other fascinating things about these stories of Jesus making abundance where there wasn't is you will notice, if you're paying attention as you read these stories, that Jesus does something that we do here as well. There's a format that he follows. The stories tell us that Jesus took the bread, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to them. Just like he will do at his final Passover, which we now celebrate as the sacrament of communion, where we take bread and we bless it and we break it and we give it to one another, and it is enough. And it is for everyone. And so the story goes. Again, Walter Brueggemann says, through the meal of abundant bread, the church both imagines and receives a society that is grounded in divine abundance. This act defies the scarcity of the wilderness in a way that is beyond explanation, made possible by the magisterial abundance whereby Jesus generates the fruitfulness of creation in places where it surely seemed not possible. So God continues to provide for us in the wilderness. Now here's another thing. A little further on in Mark chapter 6, after Jesus does this for the first time, it says this in verse 51, and they, the disciples, were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. Does that sound familiar? Again, another callback to this story that we're looking at of Exodus. They did not understand, but their hearts were hardened. It's a callback to Pharaoh's hardened heart. It's a reminder of that Pharaoh is the master of scarcity. In fact, if we go back to the story, why was it that the people of Israel needed to be liberated at all? It was because they had been enslaved. What had they been enslaved to do? They had been enslaved to build entire storehouse cities for the Pharaoh. of scarcity. Because why do you build storehouse cities? You build storehouse cities because there's only so much, and you have to get yours, and you have to store it up for the future, and you have to make sure that you and yours get yours, and everybody else is tough luck. And not only tough luck, but we will enslave you and make you slaves to build up our abundance at the cost of your provision. The whole economy of Pharaoh is based on storing up to the point of enslaving and oppressing people to make abundance possible. Going back to Exodus, we have these now liberated people who have been brought out into the wilderness. And this is perhaps, I think, the second lesson that we might learn from this story. The first, how to receive God's abundance, but the second, to trust in the way that God provides it. Because it's not obvious, right? It's not enough for us to just recognize that, well, God provides the manna. God gives very clear instructions on how it is that we are to receive it. And as is the pattern that we're beginning to see already in this story, they don't follow it. Starting in verse 20 of chapter 16 of Exodus, but they did not listen to Moses. But they did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and became foul. And Moses was angry with them. Morning by morning they gathered it as much as each needed, but when the sun grew hot, it melted. This is fascinating to me because it's like God knows that we have this scarcity mindset, that we're not going to have enough and we've got to grasp and pull and keep, right? And so as if to make the point, if you keep it, it's going to get nasty. And if you don't pick it up, it's going to disappear. Which is kind of funny, I guess, right? Unless you're a guy like me who, has a hard time learning lessons. Here it is. It's enough for today. You're in the wilderness. You better keep it. You better be ready. You have to survive. Oh no, it's going to go away one way or the other. You don't get to hold on to it. You rely on me. And then, as if that daily routine of gathering wasn't enough, God reminds them through Moses that, oh yeah, you're going to keep Sabbath. So on the sixth day, not only are you going to keep Sabbath, the text tells us that this is important. So you're not even going to keep Sabbath in the wilderness. You're especially going to keep Sabbath in the wilderness. This is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So this is the reality. God provides for us in the wilderness. And he allows us or continues to try to teach us this daily reliance. And if that wasn't enough, he says, oh, yeah, every 6 days you're going to stop producing. And you are really going to trust. So on the sixth day, you're going to gather twice as much. What you gather on the sixth day will not go bad. But you will be able to eat it on that Sabbath. Which reinforces for me that Sabbath keeping, in my mind, may be the most countercultural practice that we as Christians can engage in. Because it shows and it demonstrates our reliance and our recognition that, as we sang earlier, even the breath in our lungs comes as a gift from God, not because we deserve it, not because we earned it, not because we worked for it, not because of anything but the abundance and the blessing and the provision of God. Now, all of this is so important because I think we all experience in various ways. And we have all experienced, I think, and continue to experience as just citizens of this broken world, over and over again, places where we are in the wilderness. We've come or are coming through a pandemic. We continue to see wars of aggression and all kinds of brokenness demonstrated on a large scale in our world that can cause us to wonder, how are we going to make it through this wilderness? So I wanted to share just briefly my wilderness story with you. So my wilderness story, or at least part of it, because I've been in the wilderness a number of times in my adult life in a number of different ways, as we all have. But in the last 5 years, we have experienced a wilderness story that has been different. In that we have become what in the old days they would have called itinerant. Not by choice. And yet at every step of that journey, God has provided for us. Now, I spent a long time as a grown-up ordained pastor who, I would hear stories where people would, give testimony about how God provided, and I'd always be like, yeah, well, that's great for you. I've never experienced that. Well, now I have. Whether it be behind the wheel of a limousine crossing the Golden Gate Bridge, notice I wasn't in the back. I was driving it. Or substitute teaching, or friends who came around us in the darkest months, or places to serve in the midst of wondering where we are ultimately going. Provision after provision after provision. Now, I'm not going to stand here and pretend that I went through this like some pious, wonderful example of what it means to trust in God, because there have been days. Right? But I'm also not foolish enough to not recognize the fact that there has been provision after provision after provision. So friends, I don't know what wilderness you find yourself in. I don't know what your experience of life is. I don't know how long you've been in the wilderness. Maybe you're in this part of the story where you've just entered it and it's overwhelming and you don't know how it's going to go. Or maybe you're in year 39, day 364, and you're about to cross the Jordan. Thank you, Jesus. Or maybe you're somewhere slogging in the middle at year 20 of 40. And you're just trying to figure out how it is that you remember to see God's provision in the wilderness. Wherever you find yourself, friends, cling to this story and recognize that in the midst of that wilderness, God is providing for you day by day, morning by morning. It's not easy. It's not simple, but it is there, and it is enough. So as the band comes this morning, we're going to close with one of my old favorite covenant hymns. And as we sing, up here on the stage, you will see we have little bottles of wilderness. Right? So if you find yourself this morning in the wilderness and you need a tangible reminder that God is the God of abundance in that wilderness, we invite you to come up and just take one of these bottles so that you can bring it home with you. You can put it someplace that reminds you that there is what is it bread each and every day for everyone. And there is enough for everyone. Because God is the God of abundance, the God who provides, the God who sees his people. Amen.